The river remained its secret initially. April 17th, 1989, a Monday morning that seemed like any other in the serene town of Marlinton, West Virginia. Two local fishermen were out early on the Greenbrier River, lines cast and minds at ease, when something strange caught their gaze. A piece of blue cloth stuck in the branches on the bank, and then a white hand piercing the surface. At first, they thought it was a mannequin, maybe washtos mannequin, maybe washtos fixtinlicher. But when the current turned her face toward them, they knew. "I'll never forget it," said James Holcomb, one of the men who made the discovery. Her eyes were open, staring at the sky like she was still waiting for someone to help. It was Jessica Winters, all of 20 years old, and her body's discovery ended a frantic 3-day search that gripped the entire town. Marlinton was not a place where bad things occurred. People left their air. People left their bad things occurred. People left their error. Neighbors brought over casseroles when somebody came down with the flu. The highlight of the year was the Pioneer Days celebration, but that morning all that tranquility was shattered. Sheriff Dale Morgan arrived within minutes. His backup call crackled over the county radio, but the news was already out, as it always was in a town of slightly more than 1,000. By noon, the bridge over the river was packed with townspeople. Some cried softly. Others of the river was packed with townspeople. Others. "It felt like the heart got torn out of this town," said Margaret Wilson, Jessica's third-grade teacher. "In a place like this, we're all family, and one of our daughters was taken. The worst part? Whoever did it was still among them. But no one would know who, not for 36 long years. If you find yourself interested in true crime stories like this, subscribe to Revealed Crime Cases. We bring to light the secrets time attempted to conceal two crime cases. We bring to light the secrets time attempted to conceal all the third chooks the leaf ass. Add your city or country in the comments. Jessica Winters' tale was a haunting one for Marlinton for generations. A young woman from the West Virginia hills whose potential was ended before her life had ever really started. Born on August 12, 1968, at the tiny hospital in Pocahontas County, Jessica spent all of her 20 years just there in town, so integrated into the community that everyone knew her name, and then Linton, and all Jorpin knew her. Orksal, so integrated into the community and utilizing a large as a set of Crolans, and so that's what I least parcel. "Everybody knew Jess," declared Hannah Roberts, her kindergarten best friend. "Not knew of her, knew her. She remembered your birthday, called to ask about your sick grandmother, appeared to lend a hand when you needed it. That kind of heart's not common, even around here." At Pocahontas County High, Jessica went about her business unobtrusively. She graduated with a 3.9 GPA in 1987, working every other weekend. She competed on the track team, sang in the choir, and helped tutor younger students in math. Her senior class book dubbed her both most likely to leave and most likely to return, an oxymoron that suited her well. Her favorite place was Marlinton. Her father, Thomas Winters, said in the same living room he's left undisturbed since the day she died. The pictures on the wall chronicle her life. Jessica at 8, beaming with the blue science fair ribbon; at 16, grinning in her track uniform; then at last in her cap and gown, honor cords neatly draped over her shoulders. "Always said this town gave her roots," Thomas whispered, "but she had to find her wings. And they were only just beginning to unfold." Having spent 2 years at a local community college in Lewisburg, Jessica had recently been accepted into West Virginia University in Morgantown for the fall. She wanted to be a doctor and return home to treat mountain communities like the one she grew up in. "Healthcare out here's scarce," said Dr. Robert Simmons, the retired doctor who delivered Jessica and later mentored her. People travel hours for care that most people in communities in Cuba that most people pilos per year will prefers. The people travel hours for care that most people reals. The really elections nuts. What else or the elf? Jessica knew that. She wanted to make a difference. Even at 20, she had more passion than most people discover in a lifetime. She was also a creature of routine. Jessica began morning runs during high school and never quit. Rain or snow, 6 days a week, she'd slip on her blue Asics and take the same 5-mile route along the Greenbrier River Trail. She'd begin at the old trailhead near 9th Avenue, the river's constant flow to her right, the thid, the thid, the thin, the thid, the thee flow to her right, the thid. She would say that running made her feel like she belonged to something greater. Her mother remembered gently. The sky, the trees, the river. That was her thinking space. At that time, the Greenbrier River Trail was one of the safest locations in Pocahontas County, a place where hikers, bikers, and fishermen walked and bumped into each other with easy smiles and friendly nods. Prior to Jessica's murder, no one ever gave a second thought to a easy second thought to a bell is poor self-to. To a self-through play art every can or to start a seek something sits slime. Hit it law. Cold bit. But after that spring morning, nothing remained the same. The town's safety, its innocence, disappeared. Jessica's absence created a subdued vacuum that brushed against almost every aspect of Marlinton. She'd become integrated into the daily pace. She taught Sunday school at First Baptist. Thursday afternoons, she played piano for the senior center as the residents sang along to old hymns and folk tunes. At the annual Pioneer Days celebration, she oversaw children's activities, a soft, steady hand that allowed frazzled parents a respite. She never said no when someone was in need of assistance, said 87-year-old Mabel Thompson, who depended on Jessica to visit her once a week to sort her medication and shop for groceries. But Jessica wasn't all smiles and sugar, she also had conviction. She got vocal at town council meetings advocating for youth opportunities within Pocahontas County. She even wrote letters to the Pocahontas Times encouraging citizens to preserve the county's natural beauty while still looking for ways to expand. When police went through her room when she was gone missing, they discovered that she had left her journal on her desk. The last entry left them speechless. Marlinton owns my heart, but occasionally I think I'm attempting to grow within a pot that's too small. Is it possible to love a place and still need to leave it? To revere your home by becoming more than it prepared you to be? Jessica never had a chance to discover her answer. 3 days later, after penning those words, Friday, April 14th, 1989, she pulled her blonde ponytail back into a ponytail, wore her favorite West Virginia University sweatshirt to battle the pre-dawn chill, and set out for her morning run along the Greenbrier River Trail. It was the last time anyone who cared about her would ever see her alive. April in Pocahontas County brings its own brand of awakening. Winter's chill yields to wildflowers, the scent of wet earth, and snowmelt surging through the Greenbrier. That spring, 1989, was optimistic. The county timber mill had recently rehired men laid off the fall before. A new cafe had opened on Main Street. People were looking forward to the summer season, the hikers, canoeists, and tourists who kept their small Appalachian town alive. It was an unusually warm Friday morning, with temperatures rising to 68 degrees by mid-morning. Jessica departed from her parents' Victorian house on 9th Avenue exactly on time, 6:15 a.m. sharp. Several neighbors noticed her that morning. Mrs. Donaldson was watering her flower beds. Mr. Halstead was outside retrieving his paper. 12-year-old Kyle Jenkins was waiting for the school bus. She waved, as usual, Kyle reported later. She was wearing her Walkman. She was smiling. She looked normal. That was what made everything so out of the ordinary. Everything appeared so normal. Jessica's was a clockwork routine: 5-mile run on the Greenbrier River Trail, home by 7:30 for a shower, and then off to her 9 a.m. job at Parker's General Store. But at 8:15, she still wasn't home. Her mother, Catherine, began to pace. By 8:45, she was in a state of panic. She started calling Jessica's friends. By 9:30, when store owner Betty Parker called to inquire about whether Jessica was ill, Catherine's stomach fell. She immediately called the Pocahontas County Sheriff's Department. "We took it seriously immediately," said retired Deputy Jim Landon. "This wasn't Jessica. She never just didn't show up. And in a town like Marlinton, when someone breaks their routine, people notice quickly." Sheriff Dale Morgan dispatched all 3 deputies he had on duty to search the entire length of the trail. He went himself to get Catherine's statement. By lunchtime, with no sign of Jessica, Morgan made the call no Marlinton resident ever imagined would be made. He called the West Virginia State Police. Word got around fast, the way word always did in small towns. Furtive telephone calls, soft-spoken huddles over coffee at Dory's Diner, and whispered prayers that spread through Marlinton's 4 churches. By mid-afternoon that Friday, more than 200 volunteers had gathered at First Baptist Church, the same place where Jessica had taught Sunday school just 5 days earlier. Tom Riley, the man who ran the hardware store downtown, still remembers zu 2 år Somberball, Dizzle remembers. You're the old door, poor star son. "I'd lived in Marlinton 40 years and never seen anything like it," he said. Everyone came. The logger boys with their logging boots, teachers right out of the classroom. Even the mayor was there, coordinating search teams. The church ladies converted the kitchen into a command center, phones jangling, maps laid out on the tables. People were frightened, yes, but they believed. Believed that they'd find her. Because in a town like Marlinton, you look at that they'd find her. Because in a town like Marlinton, you look at is at the Marlinton, you look at Kempfer, you look at a drill, you think you look at you look at you look at Sheriff Dale Morgan, himself nearly overwhelmed and profoundly touched by the response, started assigning the volunteers into search parties. Some patrolled downtown, knocking on doors, sweeping alleys, looking into abandoned sheds and vacant buildings. Others rode the back roads, cruising along narrow mountain highways, searching turnouts and culverts for any hint of Jessica. The largest groups went the Greenbrier River Trail, sweeping out along its length, slogging through the brambles and shouting her name into the woods. At nightfall on the first day, floodlights were deployed on strategic parts of the trail. The search never abated. Shift work was maintained by crews throughout the night under flashlights that danced like fireflies on the riverbank. Hot coffee and sandwiches were sent from diners in the area. Batteries and additional flashlights were donated by the hardware store. By midnight, it had fallen to 42 degrees, and a cold drizzle made everything more difficult and perilous. For the volunteers, it was grueling. For Jessica, if she was still out there injured, it could have been fatal. Saturday morning saw reinforcements arrive. Local volunteer fire companies from surrounding towns showed up, as well as trained K-9 units and even a borrowed helicopter from a Virginia television news station. The area under search was expanded to a 15-mile radius from the last known location of Jessica. We discovered one of her hair ties about 2 miles up the trail, remembered State Trooper Anthony Williams. It was blue, same color she was wearing in the morning. We didn't know when she lost it, but it gave us a direction. But by Saturday afternoon, the mood of the search had shifted. What began as hope was gradually becoming dread. Officials quietly began to admit what many townspeople already suspected: Jessica's disappearance wasn't an accident. Marlinton, where everyone knew each other and life was quiet, was suddenly tense. Parents kept their children indoors. Small groups of men congregated in driveways and parking lots, whispering in dark tones. Some openly sported hunting rifles, just in case. Friday wasn't an attempt, stated First Baptist Pastor Robert Miller. The search didn't end, he said, but the emotion did change. Friday was panic. Saturday became fear and anger. It was as if everybody finally realized something horribly bad had occurred. Sunday morning dawned Clay's. Sunday morning dawned Clay. The churches conducted vigils instead of regular worship. Citizens wandered from one congregation to another, past the customary denominational lines that split the town. The Winters sat in the front pew at First Baptist, hollow-eyed, 3 sleepless nights strung out. Friends dropped off groceries they couldn't consume. Words of kindness started to taste hollow, and Monday morning arrived. At 7:38, April 17th, local fishermen James Holcomb and Pete Davidson were casting their lines roughly 4 miles downstream of town at the quiet bend of the Greenbrier River. The water was smooth. Mist clung to the surface. Pete first saw the blue cloth. Thought it was someone's trash, he would later say. Then I noticed the hand, Holcomb had testified softly. It was just so white, floating there. They called for assistance on their CB, something just about every resident still used back then just in case cell towers were out. Sheriff Morgan was on the scene within 20 minutes with a small rescue team close behind. It was a careful, laborious procedure. Jessica's body had snagged on underwater branches, and the current hampered efforts to dislodge her without destroying evidence. 4 men entered the icy water and toiled for almost an hour before managing to pull her out. The medical examiner's initial notes were curt, light scratches on her face and arms, a ripped shoulder on her blue WVU sweatshirt. From the state of her body, they estimated she had been in the river anywhere from 48 to 72 hours, which coincided with her disappearance that Friday morning. Word came to the town ahead of Jessica's beers beer slingens beers beer. Word to the town ahead of Jessica's beerance and New Whirlin, which is this beer, even miles were the review of the race, which was Marlon's worst were. People heard in hushed tones over back doors, over phones, and through sobbing calls. Neighborhoods reported later that you could hear Catherine Winter's screams down the street. The noise traveled on the spring air, raw, heavy, indelible. People converged silently on porches, clasping hands, some embracing wordlessly as the word passed from house to house. By mid-afternoon, the same town that had mobilized as a unit to look for Jessica lay eerily quiet. Schools made the announcement that they would not open the following day. Even the volunteer fire department went on nighttime patrols, something they'd never been required to do previously. It shattered us, explained veteran Mayor Harold Phillips. Not simply losing Jessica, and that was bad enough, but what else came with it? We lost our sense of security. Suddenly people were looking over their shoulders, wondering, was it somebody we knew? Or some stranger who just came and went without leaving a trace? Either notion sent shivers down your spine. The complete autopsy came the next Wednesday, as bad as everyone had suspected. Jessica had been sexually assaulted and murdered by manual strangulation. Much of the evidence had been washed away by the river. The bruising on her neck revealed unmistakable signs of force. She probably died sometime shortly after leaving for her run. That something next for a run. That be certain how she earners was pure. So how old it is after getting sent for her runs directly on our suspicious. He's some sort on this hurdles abs. But just for up to some source and do a suit for her she knows just like potentially close scarf. There's that as I just you four things remember and learn. The next few days altered Marlinton forever. Doors that had never seen a key now had double bolts on them. Parents who once waved the kids off to the bus began driving them instead. And the Greenbrier River Trail, once the community's pride and joy, became quiet. Even during spring, when it colorfully painted the valley anew, no one ventured near it. We lost something more than Jessica, stated Hannah Roberts, her best friend since child Bell. Kingsenge, her best friend since child? Hold it, her best friend since child, place no child's around? We lost the town we believed that we lived in, that sense that we were safe here, that we could trust one another. Even when they caught him all those years later, we never really regained that. Nevertheless, the neighborhood attempted to keep itself intact. Individuals took food to the Winters house, made contributions, and ensured her parents were never alone. Jessica's funeral service at First Baptist was filled to capacity, pews filled, aisles filled, hundreds more standing outside in the rain, listening over speakers the high school AV club had hurriedly arranged. As April became May, the search continued, but actual leads were few. The river, the very one that had brought so much beauty to the valley, had also swept away too many answers. Sheriff Dale Morgan and his small crew interviewed scores of local men, verifying alibis, searching for weaknesses in their accounts, but without proof, it was all a matter of notes and guesses. By Memorial Day, Marlinton was getting back in rhythm, but things were D. Smiles didn't linger as long. The blues hung around like mist in the hollers. Neighbors gazed at each other a little longer than usual. Jessica's senior photo hung in windows all over town, surrounded by the single word, justice. It was a subtle reminder that her murderer was still loose, perhaps even taking the same sidewalks as the rest of them. The common consisted of Sheriff Morgan, 4 full-time deputies, 2 part-timers, and 1 dispatcher. Their largest cases typically were a DUI, a domestic problem, or a shoplifting call, not a murder. We were way over our heads from the very beginning, Morgan conceded decades later from his retirement home in Florida. We hadn't worked a single homicide in the decade leading up to Jessica. Our top equipment was a Polaroid camera and a small kit of fingerprint powder. DNA testing then was science fiction rather than fact for small police departments. Their evidence room? A padlocked supply closet that had been repurposed. Their entire department's annual budget wouldn't have funded the police force of a major city for a weekend. Nevertheless, when Jessica's body was discovered in the Greenbrier River, Morgan never was discovered in the Greenbrier River. Morgan never was believes. I kidding for he would rather be the force instead. He reached for the telephone and dialed the West Virginia State Police Headquarters in Charleston. I knew we needed help, he said. This wasn't just another case. This was Jessica. It mattered. In a matter of hours, Captain William Haynes showed up with 4 investigators and a mobile crime lab, essentially a van filled with more equipment and devices than the entire Pocahontas department had together. Even the FBI deployed a consultant, Special Agent Thomas Reynolds, not to do the job, but to coach and assist. It was a jurisdictional dance, remembered former state police investigator Robert Campbell with a wry grin, small-town pride colliding with big agency procedure. Everyone wanted to assist, but no one wanted to tread on toes. Technically, this was still Sheriff Morgan's case, but to his credit, Pride didn't get in. His credit, Pride didn't get in the things wrong. Your areas credit. Pride didn't get into it. He let the more senior investigators take charge where it made sense. That doesn't happen all that often in small-town law enforcement. The venerable courthouse in Marlinton, constructed way back in 1894, was suddenly the hub of the investigation. The grand jury room, typically a mousy place except for the occasional traffic hearing, was converted into a full-blown command center. Maps were plastered on the walls, pictures were tacked up in orderly rows, and timelines crisscrossed with red yarn and scribbled notes. It appeared to be something from a big city detective show for a small mountain town. There was little physical evidence to go on, but what they did have, they treated gingerly. Jessica's body, following its photographing where it lay, was transported to Charleston for a thorough autopsy. Her ripped clothing was placed in evidence bags for potential fiber analysis. Police collected soil and plant samples from the riverbank, and a number of shoe prints that had been located close to where her blue hair tie was found were cast in plaster. But the river was the enemy. As state investigator Robert Campbell later described, water ruins everything. It washes away DNA, smudges fingerprints, pulls fibers downstream. And in 1989, they didn't have today's forensic weapons to battle that kind of destruction. Nevertheless, the team continued working. Officers canvassed a 2-mile radius around the trail, inquiring of every resident where they had been on that Friday morning. They also questioned more than 60 of the volunteers who had worked on the search in case anyone saw something or somebody they hadn't known was significant at the time. By the end of that first week, 3 names had popped to the top of their list. All local men, all who were known to travel on the Greenbrier River Trail in the early morning hours. One was a sex offender who'd just been paroled and returned to Marlington 6 months before. Another was a handyman, nice enough, but a couple of residents said he'd been a bit too curious about Jessica. The third was a married high school teacher with quiet whispers circulating over several years about impropriety with his former students. Every man was taken into the courthouse for questioning. The interrogation room was bare. There was a table, 2 chairs, and a tape recorder that beeped softly when operating. Lacking concrete forensic evidence, investigators had to trust their gut. They looked for nervous habits, for gaps in stories, for any slip-up that would betray something only the killer would be aware of. You get a sense for individuals covering something up, Morgan would explain later, but a gut feeling isn't proof. We needed something that we could substantiate. Simultaneously, the atmosphere in town changed. The shock and tragedy were gradually being replaced by suspicion. Everybody wished to assist. Tips poured in, scores and scores of them. One person noticed a suspicious truck at the trailhead. Another recalled a guy with scratches on his arms at the gas station. Each and every tip had to be investigated, which strained the already exhausted team to its limits. People did have good intentions, said Deputy Jim Landon, but with each decent lead, we received 20 that were rumors or people taking advantage of the time to bring up a suspect by suspect. The alibis cleared. The paroled offender was ruled out first. Bus fare tickets and several witnesses established that he'd been in Charleston April 13th through 15th to attend a parole check-in and job interview. The handyman came next. Records and 3 members of the Methodist Church confirmed he'd been doing some pipe fixing at the church that morning when Jessica disappeared. That left the teacher. He had passed 2 polygraphs, just barely, but both were returned as inconclusive. But still, there was nothing hard enough to arrest him. By the second week, the momentum was waning. The state police mobile unit remained parked outside the courthouse, but half the additional investigators had already been called back. The FBI consultant departed for Quantico. It was a cold dose of reality. Rural departments have a breaking point, and 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 do also array. And then there was a recess. A dog walker and a woman spotted something half hidden in the mud along the Greenbrier River Trail. It was Jessica's Walkman, 2 miles away from where her body had been discovered. There was a cassette inside, Whitney Houston's second album, and the tape was pre-programmed to So Emotional, the same song Jessica's roommate indicated she had been listening to non-stop that week. The Walkman was sent hurriedly to the state papai, The technicians took pains to dry it out and run their fingers over it looking for fingerprints. They recovered 3 partials. 2 belonged to Jessica. The third was unidentified. But this was 1989. There were no databases of fingerprints, no rapid computer searches. Each comparison had to be made manually, print by print. Most of the men were eager to give up their fingerprints. A couple of them had to be talked into it, but ultimately all of the prints came back the same. No match. Then a new lead. Investigators reintroduced the tracking dogs, hoping they would be able to detect Jessica's scent once more from the location of the Walkman. The dogs this time left the main trail and took a faint path that arced into a small clearing some half-mile distant. The terrain was one of fight, trampled grass, broken limbs, and what odd. For the first time, said investigator Robert Campbell, we had what seemed to be a genuine crime scene. But it was 2 weeks old, rain, animals, and people had all gone through by then. Despite that, there were hints. One boot print that didn't belong to any of the search volunteers or emergency responders, and 3 cigarette butts. Marlboro read 100s, not a hard-to-find brand in the country, but one that wasn't commonly sold in Marlington. The boot print, however, was the true showstopper, a size 11 Wolverine work boot with a unique wear pattern on the left heel. Investigators canvassed all hardware and outdoor supply stores within a 50-mile radius that had sold that model. They got the names of 17 purchasers. 16 were found and interviewed and cleared in short order. But one name was different. 32 years old, a woodworker who had been in town only days following Jessica's murder. "We really thought we had him," Morgan told a reporter later. Carver worked at the mill, kept to himself, and he left immediately after the killing. That raised eyebrows. Carver had allegedly quit his job in Tennessee to take a new one in Kentucky. There was an interstate alert. 2 deputies went all the way to Lexington, where they spotted him doing manual labor at a lumber company. Carver didn't flee. He was courteous, polite, and cooperative. His boots were the same brand, but not the Desits. His fingerprint did not match the single fingerprint from the Walkman either. A search of his house and truck yielded nothing incriminating. Another blind alley. By summer, the case was thick with paper, 143 pages of reports, 211 interviews, and 87 cataloged pieces of evidence. But it hadn't yielded what was most important, a suspect. The state police mobile unit broke down its equipment and emptied out of Marlington in late June. The courthouse war room was dismantled and its maps and files warehoused in a storage room at the sheriff's office. "We never threw in the towel," Morgan maintained, "but fresh crimes popped up, new victims required assistance, and we just didn't have the resources." Case meetings grew less regular. Months became weeks. Jessica Winter's case fell into what no one ever wanted it to become, a cold case. Not forgotten, but stagnant. For the men who had invested their hearts into it, that reality came hard. "I carried it home every night," Deputy Jim Landon admitted years later. "My wife said I'd talk about Jessica in my sleep." These small-town cases, they get inside you. She wasn't just a name in a file. I'd handed her candy on Halloween, watched her. I'd handy on Halloween, watched her, watched her. Inonsred just, or the job you ein, or the who's lunch, you're at the hotel. And then I'm looking at crime scene photos. That kind of thing doesn't leave you. For the Winter family, the quieting of the investigation was its own form of sorrow. Each strange car parked in front of their house ignited a spark of hope. Each ring on the phone could have been it. But it never was. The town itself was hung in limbo. Folks went to work, the stores reopened, the rhythm of life returned, but there was something missing. Peace. Sheriff Morgan stored Jessica's senior photo in a frame on his desk for all the years he worked until he retired in 2003. By that time, the case file occupied 3 cardboard boxes, a fixture in the evidence room. New deputies were shown it on their first day, an initiation of sorts into the department's most enduring enigma. "Occasionally, I think about what we might have done with today's technology," Morgan said afterward. "DNA databases, cell phone tracking, cameras on every street corner. Would we have had him within a week? Would justice for Jessica have come before 36 years elapsed? What time is it in your time zone? Leave a comment and let us know when and where you're watching. If this case hits home with you, please like and share. It brings new perspectives to these cold cases. You never know who may be out there carrying the missing link Catherine Winters never departed the white Victorian house on Ninth Avenue, the house where Jessica's giggles once rang through the halls. She remained there for 36 years. Neighbors ensured that Old Victorian never appeared to be in disrepair. Unasked, anonymously, they repainted it every few years, faded white with sky blue trim, as if maintaining the home in good condition was their way of paying tribute to Catherine and Jessica. I stay because this is where Jessica would come home to, Catherine told the Pocahontas Times in 1999 on the 10-year anniversary of her daughter's death. Moving would feel like giving up, like telling her we're not waiting anymore. And Catherine never did stop waiting. Each morning at 6:15 sharp, the same time Jessica had departed on her last run, Catherine would take a seat in her bay window, gazing out onto the street. At first, it was simply a matter of getting through the early hours, but with the passage of time, it had become a ritual, something ingrained in her very breathing. Some thought it was morbid, her husband Thomas conceded, but to her, it was standing watch, making sure Jessica didn't get lost, making sure whoever did it knew someone was still vigilant. Jessica's senior photo was plastered above the fireplace, center of attention, the moja center of attention, the clue, the palos bay of attention to it. What? It's Reese, it with his one. As and chap 2. Jessica's senior photo was plastered above the fireplace, center of attention, the she was dressed in a blue sweater that made her eyes sparkle even brighter in the picture. Her blonde hair cascaded gently down over her shoulders, where it curved around a timid smile that exposed the tiny gap between her front teeth, something she was always slightly embarrassed about. Catherine ensured that photograph remained pristine. She pulled the curtains throughout the day so that sunlight never came near it. That picture is how I keep her here. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I talk to her. I tell her about my day, about the town, about the case. I know it might sound strange to some people, but mothers understand. Every year on April 17th, the date when Jessica's body was discovered, the Marlington Methodist Church conducted a memorial service in her memory. The first year, over 400 came, almost half the town. The fifth year, it had fallen to about 105th year. It had fallen to about 105th see it south. Of the clocks, one of their four sit down. You're at the south of the pursuit. Even 30 years later, though, some 40 devoted friends, neighbors, and old classmates continued to come. They sang the hymns that Jessica loved best, recollected their memories, and lit candles in her memory. Remember, the community never forgot, said Pastor Eliza Hamilton, who started to lead the service in 2007. Even people who didn't know Jessica came. They knew it wasn't just about the past. It was about Hastoler. Slowly, Catherine directed her sorrow into purpose. She became a subdued but persistent voice for other families of missing and murdered women. Her dinner table vanished beneath piles of binders and folders organized tidily by state, year, and case status. She was searching for patterns, Thomas said, for anything the police had overlooked. Catherine sent letters, dozens of them, full of notes, speculations, and newspaper clippings to Sheriff Morgan, then to each successive sheriff. Some were grateful for her persistence. Others, admittedly, weren't. But Catherine never did quit. The neighborhood also saw her through the years in quiet, consistent ways. They referred to it as the Winter's Watch. Somebody always stopped by each day. Each night there was a hot supper on the porch. When Thomas's health began to fail in the early 2000s, neighbors took him the 2 hours to Roanoke for his doctor's appointments. Grief is shared in a small town, said longtime Mayor Harold Phillips. The Winters' loss was our loss. Their waiting for justice became a burden the entire town shared. We could not bring Jessica home, but we could share some of that burden with them. Even as Catherine grew old, her hair silvered, her pace slower, she came to every new deputy's swearing in greeting them afterwards with quiet dignity. She'd smile and say, "I'm Catherine Winters. My daughter's case is still open." She sent Christmas cards to investigators, birthday notes too, each one written in careful cursive, always ending with a gentle reminder, sometimes a thought, sometimes a request to recheck a piece of evidence. There was always something remarkable about Catherine Winters. Even after all those years, she never turned bitter, just quietly, unshakably determined. "Never mad," added Deputy Sarah Collins, who had come aboard in 2015. "Never bitter, just determined." She ensured that Jessica wasn't just another name in a file in a box. And she really did. Due to Catherine, every officer in the department had Jessica's name, face, and facts of her case memorized. Her determination kept the story afloat long after most towns would have forgotten. Then 2019, the 30th anniversary of Jessica's murder. Catherine was 76 now, frail, her body smaller, her steps slower. But when she stepped up to the microphone at the memorial service, her voice sounded the same quiet, unshakable strength it always had. "My daughter is owed justice," she addressed the audience, "and I will wait as long as it takes. Whoever committed this act needs to know mothers never give up. Ever, 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 ever." She didn't know then that her decades-long wait was about to end. It was July 17th, 2025. Summer in Marlington was in full swing. At Watoga State Park, a mere 15 minutes from town, children splashed and yelled in the refreshing lake water. Parents and grandparents reclined on folding chairs on the beach, fanning themselves with paper church picnic programs. The air was heavy with the smell of sunscreen and charcoal. Among them was Melissa Daniels, 53, a nurse at the Pocahontas Memorial Hospital. She'd brought her two grandkids for their weekly swim. As the little one sprinted to the water, Melissa sat down next to another woman, Rebecca Thornton, 55, a fifth-grade teacher at the local elementary school. "We weren't close," Melissa later told investigators. "We knew each other like everyone does here. Our kids went to school today, to two. Our kids went to school to Tukla, which went to school. We're checking the shoulders for blood occur. In just Taylor, I was late school. Our Tunkertos daughters went to school and does here. We chat at church or at the grocery store, just surface-level stuff." The two women exchanged the usual pleasantries, compliments about their grandkids, jokes about the heat, talk of an upcoming church fundraiser. But then the conversation drifted somewhere else. They began reminiscing about summers they themselves had spent in that same park many years ago. "Remember that huge wooden raft in the deep end?" Rebecca asked. Melissa chuckled. "Everyone used to quarrel over who got to go first." Rebecca's smile softened a bit. "They removed it after the Winters girl was killed," she said softly. "Too many parents didn't want children swimming out that far. It might have been just another passing reference to Jessica. Her name had long since entered Marlington's communal lexicon." But something in Rebecca's voice braked Melissa hard. She said it oddly, Melissa remembered after, as if she was testing me. And then there was a flash of candor between two women who'd both spent years keeping their own uneasy doubts locked away in silence. "I always wondered about Roy," Rebecca said, still staring at the water. Melissa's eyes snapped back to her. "Bennett?" Rebecca didn't immediately respond, simply gave a tiny conspiratorial nod. Of course, Melissa understood whom she was talking about. Everyone in Marlington knew Roy Bennett. Roy had been a staple in town since the early 1980s, owner of Bennett's Hardware on Main Street, ex-Chamber of Commerce president, longtime church deacon, volunteer fireman. His store supported Little League squads. His Christmas lights display brought in visitors from 2 counties away. He'd even contributed the funds for the new playground at the elementary school. To everyone else, Roy Bennett was the epitome of a small-town gentleman. Melissa asked, although her pulse had already begun to accelerate. Rebecca looked about to ensure that no one in the vicinity could possibly overhear. "I worked part-time at the hardware store back in '89, she replied softly. "Before Roy purchased it from Tom Riley in '92, She paused. The Monday after they discovered Jessica, Roy came into the store with new scratches on his forearms. Said he'd been out clearing brush the weekend before some night. I believe Sir Bush's store, which in Chesapeake to the store, or torches. I still was others of arbiters. I guess. 406 sloughs, but a lot of people had scratches. We were all out looking for the woods that week. That's what I said to myself too, Rebecca said. Except Roy didn't go with the search groups. He said he had family business in Elkins that weekend. She breathed slowly, and there was something else. His boots. His boots? His boots? He always had Wolverine work boots. The same style for years, but that Monday, new ones. Tom even commented on it. Roy claimed he lost the E. Rebecca nodded, her voice dropping still lower. I didn't think much of it then, but years later, I overheard Sheriff Morgan talking at the diner, mentioned prints at the scene. Wolverine boots. Size 11. Melissa swallowed hard. Roy wore size 11. Rebecca nodded slightly. Melissa at last asked the question hanging in the air. Melissa's question hung in the air, heavy but quiet. Rebecca gazed down, turning her wedding ring lazily. Who would have listened to me? She whispered. I was only a part-time clerk, and he was Roy Bennett, the businessman of esteem, church deacon, Mr. Marlington. I didn't have evidence, just a feeling of unease. And my husband worked for him after he purchased the store. We needed that job. Their talk might have stopped there, two women allowing old discomfort to finally catch its breath before the summer talk of children yanked them back to reality. But Melissa wasn't finished. She had a tale of her own to tell. After Jessica died, she started, I was on night shift at the hospital. Roy arrived about 2 a.m. with blood on his hand. Told me he slipped up with a knife when he was repairing something in his garage. When I was dressing his wound, he began discussing Jessica. Just out of the blue. Called it tragic. Says that no one would ever be apprehended because the evidence was most likely destroyed, washed away by the river. Rebecca leaned her head. Lots of people said that, though. It wasn't what he said, Melissa breathed. It was the way he said it. The way he spoke of marks on her throat, of her Walkman, things which weren't in the papers, and his exsic, and his exsic, and he exarf. When his exsic, and his increase out considering instead worse for the cure or stalantus. Of water surf. She hesitated, her voice constricting. It was as if he was pleased the river had swallowed the evidence. Rebecca's face paled. Did you report it? I did, Melissa replied softly. Told a deputy I was dating at the time. He dismissed it. Said they'd already eliminated all the people who had purchased those boots. Said Roy had an alibi, that he'd been in Charleston for a business conference that morning. Their grandchildren laughed and splashed in the golden afternoon sunlight, but they sat still. The water sounded a dull background to what existed between them, 36 years of doubt and silence. And last, Rebecca said something. My cousin works for the state police now, she said, in the cold case unit. She told me last weekend they've got new DNA tools now, stuff that works on samples even if they're really old or degraded. Melissa glanced. Would they reopen a case just based on feelings? Rebecca met her eyes. Jessica's mom still resides in that house on 9th Avenue. Still waiting. Don't you think she deserves to know someone? Still looking? Over the decades, Jessica Winter's case had been somewhat of a nomad. Her evidence boxes, taped, labeled, and worn from constant handling, had been relocated 7 times. From the Pocahontas County Sheriff's Department to the state police headquarters in Charleston, and then back again when a new sheriff became interested. Every relocation was meticulously documented, every seal examined and resealed, and yet nothing was ever lost. Every picture, every strand of hair, every piece of paper survived. The case had been sustained by those who would not permit it to go away. Then, in August 2025, the very same boxes landed at the newly enlarged Cold Case Division of the West Virginia State Crime Lab in Charleston. The lab had just been refurbished 2 years before on new federal money. Now equipped with technology the 1989 investigators couldn't even have dreamed of. When we originally worked this case, DNA testing was just a concept, said Dr. Eleanor Simmons, the director of the lab. At that point, you had to have big, clean samples to obtain a result. That's not the case anymore. The first thing on the team's agenda, Jessica's clothes, carefully preserved for decades, having spent time in the river. With an instrument called the MVAC, basically a wet vacuum that is high-tech and is used to extract microscopic cells from fabric, technicians set about working on the sweatshirt Jessica had worn that morning. Old-fashioned swabbing is able to miss as much as 90% of DNA found on porous surfaces. The MVAC penetrates way down deep into the threads. Even years later, it's able to recover material, and within those threads, something had endured. The 3 cigarette butts found close to the disturbed clearing, the ones previously written off as being too waterlogged to be worth it, were tackled next. Through a novel method called methylation analysis, the researchers were able to extract degraded DNA bits from the filters, something previously unimaginable decades ago. Even more promising was the partial fingerprint lifted from Jessica's Walkman. With cutting-edge enhancement software, technology originally built for national security, analysts were able to digitally rebuild ridge patterns that had once been too faint to compare. "We're not creating new evidence," Dr. Simmons said. "We're simply able to see what's always been there." What the early investigators couldn't uncover with the tools of their time was now finally coming to light. While the Charleston laboratory crew worked methodically through each piece of physical evidence, Lieutenant Sarah Matthews brought together a new investigative team with one mission: bring justice to Jessica Winters. Their first task was a simple yet intimidating one. Begin at page 1. Read through each document. Re-question each witness. Re-scrutinize each lead that had long since turned cold. And before long, one name began to emerge from the fringy Radzia interim. From the fringy Alwood Boberg of the Fringy River, and the Idris Nash, and Sarah Rastra, and Tantigut Trukun, and Shulm, of the Laughing Source of Lafsreich, and Jusiska Fringy Tinkle, which is. He continued appearing. Lieutenant Matthews would also attest. Not in the official reports, but wedged into the margins. Casual references, sidebar indications, offhand mentions, always lurking in the background but never in the foreground. Witnesses described Roy as a frequent presence on the Greenbrier River Trail. Others noted he was familiar with Jessica from her work at Parker's General Store part-time. A few even remembered noting scratches on his arms shortly after she vanished. But in the whole file, his initial interview occupied only a single page, while the case itself stretched across thousands. That seemed odd to the new team. Upon further investigation, they discovered that Roy Bennett's alibi, his alleged business trip to Charleston on the morning Jessica disappeared, had never been verified. Hotel records indicated he had booked a room at the Charleston Marriott for April 13th to 14th, 1989, but there was no indication that he'd ever stayed there. And when cold case researchers accessed archived banking records, they found that there were no credit card purchases in Charleston over the weekend. His alibi was taken on his own word, said Detective James Wilson. That would not wash today. But then, in a small commutes, walked small commutes in the text with my brother, or watched two of the trip, but then in a small commute, he was someone to be respected. Nobody wanted to think he could have been involved. As the investigation continued, the team constructed a complete profile of Roy Bennett's life and position in Marlington. A native of nearby Lewisburg, Roy had relocated to town in 1982 to work at the hardware store he eventually purchased. 1 year later, he was a member of the Volunteer Fire Department, then the Chamber of Commerce, followed by First Baptist Church, the very church that Jessica attended youth group in 1987. He inserted himself into every corner of town life, Detective Wilson stated. Business owner, church leader, youth sports sponsor, board member, you name it. He constructed himself into someone the town needed. That well-crafted reputation could have been just what protected him from further suspicion in 1989. The deceased deputy who'd initially questioned him was a church deacon who'd worked alongside Bennett. The business trip excuse? Another local business person, later found in the records to have received, quietly, a private loan from Bennett shortly after, had also vouched for it. In September 2025, 27 individuals who had known Bennett during the late 80s were re-questioned by investigators. The majority of them portrayed him as courteous, serious, diligent, a tad strict, perhaps, but dependable. But among the women who had worked for him, a different story appeared. He was intense, said one woman who worked at the hardware store in the early 90s. Not in an inappropriate way, but he'd stand too close, look at you too long, comment on your outfit in a way that made you feel uneasy. Another woman who had worked part-time there as a teenager remembered how he'd frequently give her rides home. I always had a reason to say no, she said. He never did anything you could report, but he made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Something just didn't feel right. Then came one of the most important discoveries so far, an old 1987 incident report. A woman jogger had complained of being stalked on the Greenbrier River Trail. The man she reported was questioned briefly, but never charged. His name? Roy Bennett. The report was general. The case had been closed quietly, but in 2025, investigators found that same woman, now residing in North Carolina. She recalled it awed. He worked at the hardware store, she said. He would ask me about my runs, what days, what sections of the trail I preferred. I thought he was being nice to me, but now, in retrospect, it does not feel innocent. By October, the first forensic reports from the Charleston lab began to roll in, and with them, the revelation the Winters family had hoped for decades. The enhanced fingerprint lifted from Jessica's Walkman showed 7 matching points with Roy Bennett's fingerprints on file from his old volunteer firefighter application. It wasn't enough for a full legal match, but it was close, very close, enough to make him a primary person of interest. Then came the DNA results. Technicians found male DNA embedded deep within the fibers of Jessica's sweatshirt, material that had survived nearly 4 decades of time, water, and decay. When they analyzed, the genetic profile showed clear familial markers connected directly to the Bennett paternal line. Perfect, one of your most dramatic chunks so far. Here's the YouTube script refined version, tweaked to emotional pacing, retention, and tension levels. Just how viral true crime channels like Explore With Us or The Chapter would format it. To ensure a positive match, investigators required one more thing, a new DNA sample from Roy Bennett himself. Here's where investigation becomes chess, said Lieutenant Sarah Matthews. We had credible suspicion, but not enough to warrant a court order against ordets, or the Ugokentavert, and what's chin for a board slot averages, or of the it's consult. We would it's sword for it you or the end of speak over, or the it's fin, or it's slice. We needed to come up with another way. Undercover, the team started monitoring. Bennett, now 68, lived by himself and had a routine schedule. Coffee every day at the same tiny diner. Then a brief visit to the post office and off to his hardware store. Under covert observation, investigators picked up a discarded coffee cup, collecting multiple DNA samples from the rim and lid. When results came back in the lab on October 28, 2025, the room was silent. A 99.97% match with DNA on Jessica Winters' clothing. That was the moment, Matthew said. After 36 years, we could finally say with scientific certainty we knew who had killed Jessica Winters. The team worked day and night throughout November, developing a case strong enough to take to court. They constructed a minute-by-minute timeline establishing motive and opportunity for Bennett. They chronicled his extensive history of fascination with female joggers. They even found records that indicated Bennett had bought brand-new Wolverine work boots the next day after Jessica went missing, replacing the same exact style he'd been wearing for years. Then came the ultimate break. In carrying out a search warrant on a storage unit Bennett rented in Lewisburg, investigators opened a padlocked metal toolbox. Inside was a little plastic bag. In that bag, a blue hair tie and a case for Whitney Houston's second album, no prints, and cleaned fingerprints, but their significance was clear. "Some murderers take trophies," said Detective James Wilson. "Something that links them to the crime. It is led to the crime. Boasts for its smarts. It too often removed intelligence from lesson excerpts and just the lure." And in this instance, it provided us with the final piece we required to convince a jury. On December 3rd, 2025, while Marlington made final preparations for its Christmas parade, a tradition organized by Roy Bennett himself for decades, law enforcement made silent preparations for an arrest that would forever alter the town. If this case has riveted you as much as it has us, help get the word out. This is not about creating a channel. This is about doing justice to stories such as Jessica's. Cold cases do count, because solving them reminds us that time doesn't erase truth. Please share this video with someone who believes in justice that endures. For 36 years, Roy Bennett had been a pillar of Marlington. His hardware store wasn't just a business, it was a gathering place. Locals stopped by to catch up on current events, discuss hunting season, or seek advice on fixing the house. Each December, his window display attracted families from throughout Pocahontas County. His charitable donations provided Little League uniforms, school carnivals, even the refurbishment of the town's old clock tower. "He was the guy you called when something needed to be done," said Mayor Patricia Collins, who had worked alongside him on the Chamber of Commerce for more than a decade. If the fire department was in need of funds, Roy staged the fundraiser. If the school needed equipment, Roy contributed and arrived with equipment to install it. That hard-earned reputation made what came next even more difficult to believe. At 6:15 a.m. on December 4th, 2025, the precise moment Jessica Winters had departed for her last run 36 years prior, a group of state police and Pocahontas County deputies circled Bennett's two-story colonial residence on Maple Street. Lieutenant Matthews had selected that moment specifically. For 36 years, he woke up knowing what he'd done, she said afterward. While Jessica's family woke know what he'd done, she said afterward. "I was just slaying an almost wobble customer with 36 slaves fighting and chorusiper. Real story screenplay, concocted Errol Emerson's two sculptors, Eric Toronto, It felt right that his last morning of freedom should start at the same time hers did. Bennett opened the door in his robe. For Matthews, the arrest report says when she introduced herself and informed him he was under arrest for killing Jessica Winters, he nodded. Beautifully intense section. Here's your rephrased version crafted for a mature, emotionally grounded YouTube audience, age 50 plus, keeping the suspense and humanity intact while reading like a true crime documentary with heart. News of Roy Bennett's arrest spread through Marlington almost as fast as the word of Jessica Winters' disappearance had back in 1989. By 8 a.m., there was a small crowd in front of the Pocahontas County Sheriff's Office where Bennett was being booked. By noon, Main Street was lined with national news vans, their satellite dishes catching the winter sun, reporters ready to go live. For some who grew up here, the arrest was surreal, near impossible to believe. This was the same man who had hugged Jessica's weeping parents. The same man who had given the eulogy at her memorial, who had assisted in raising funds for her charity in her name. Now he was accused of being the one who ended her life. It's like discovering your favorite uncle had a double life, commented Michael Peterson, who used to work part-time at Bennett's Hardware when he was a teenager. You try to fit the pieces together, but they just don't fit. None of it adds up. That question, try none oldo turchik, a practical quartet, you drive cord and you ask the cook an hour than and on the chair. Streets to praise the steps for that, the night to the kennel like the corner, criminal. Cast like to keep the little can have slop. Rang out in the town like a church bell that refused to cease ringing. The solution, detectives discovered, wasn't merely in the capabilities of 1980s forensic science. It lay hidden deep within the very context of small-town culture itself. At the time, Bennett had been questioned once, briefly, just once. The years he'd been working alongside his questioning deputy made him a familiar face, one that didn't raise suspicion. His alibi, a purported business trip, was never questioned. And those new work boots, the same make associated with tracks at the scene? They passed under suspicion with ease because he had purchased them in Lewisburg, not locally. It creates blind spots, particularly for investigators who belong to that same community. And Roy Bennett had played those blind spots to perfection. Following Jessica's death, he did not go underground, he did just the opposite. He got more involved, more visible, more charitable. "He was in plain sight," said Sheriff David Harrison. Each act of kindness became a further shield. He constructed a version of himself so reliable that nobody ever felt like examining under it. During his initial hearing on December 18, 2025, the evidence against Bennett was overwhelming. DNA off Jessica's sweatshirt matched the sample from Bennett's thrown-away coffee cup with 99.97% accuracy. The fingerprints from Jessica's Walkman were enhanced and revealed 7 corresponding ridge points to Bennett's volunteer fireman file. And then there was the reconstructed timeline, the one item that blew apart his well-crafted alibi. Records showed Bennett checking out of the Charleston Marriott at 5:30 a.m. on April 14, 1989, not staying for a morning meeting as he'd claimed. The drive from Charleston to Marlington takes about ends of Brisamin has he his up for. The trace is Bernuot. Astegas is the Sorius. He is an Aries. It's about 10. That meant he could have been back in town by 7:45 a.m. Jessica started her run at 6:15. She was reported missing just after 8:30. For 36 years, nobody had confirmed his activities during that decisive window. Then the contents of his Lewisburg storage unit, the ones that made everyone's stomach sink. A blue hair elastic, an empty Whitney Houston second album cassette case. The same things Jessica had on her. No fingerprints remained, but forensic testing revealed microscopic traces of Jessica's skin cells on the hair tie preserved in that sealed bag for over 3 decades. For some offenders, the connection doesn't end with the crime, explained forensic psychologist Dr. Marcus Reynolds. Objects like these let them revisit the moment. It's about control. Quiet, secret control. The town's reaction came in waves. First disbelief of belief, first belief, first disbelief, belief of true disbelief, first disbelief, earthlesis. Not only at Bennett, but at a system that had let him slip through for so long. And then reflection. Folks relived moments, words, even jokes or movements that suddenly seemed off. I let him watch my daughters, Elizabeth Simmons told a town meeting the next week, still shaken. He was the sponsor of their softball team. I trusted him with absolutely everything. Others started to understand that strange seconds they used to wave away. The remarks, the stares, the intuitions weren't as innocent as they seemed. In a matter of days, a number of former female employees came forward with tales they'd never before revealed. Flawless. This part of the story has the emotional center of the narrative, where betrayal and justice intersect. Your rewritten version, done in a manner that sounds like a YouTuber in a true crime channel addressing an older, introspective audience. Friendly, emotional, and consistent in tone, Nothing illegal ever came up about Roy Bennett then, but in retrospect, trends became clear. He'd have excuses to be alone with the women who worked there, said Jennifer Davis, who had worked at the hardware store in the mid-1990s. Stuff in the back room, after-hours projects, always presented as work. But something didn't sit right. Another woman remembered something that, at the time, she'd brushed off. I used to notice his truck behind me when I'd walk home after closing. Told myself it was just coincidence it's uglaf. It was just coincidence of. Old myself it was just coincidence. But the most chilling discovery wasn't about how he acted. It was about how much he'd been watching. When police searched Bennett's home computer, they found hundreds of archived articles on Jessica's vanishing. He'd gathered every news update, every investigation report, every new forensic study on DNA or cold case technology. He'd even spoken at fundraisers for the sheriff's department, several that included open house tours of refurbished Eve. He was studying us, said retired Sheriff Dale Morgan, now in his late 70s, studying the investigation. He knew what we had and what we didn't. Honestly, he probably knew more about the case file than some of my own deputies. For Catherine Winters, now 82, the arrest brought a storm of emotions that words could barely contain. After nearly 4 decades, justice had arrived. But with a sour truth was the fact that the man who had killed her daughter had been by her side the entire time. He'd been by her side during memorial services, been polite at fundraising events, even delivered meals to her doorstep in the weeks following Jessica's passing. He stared at me in the eye at Jessica's funeral, Catherine said to the press, her tone firm but weary. He took my hand and said they'd catch who did it. But he already knew that. The first hearing was held in the same courthouse where Jessica's initial case had previously been managed. The room itself had evolved more light, screens, recording devices, but the burden of history sat as heavily. When Bennett walked into the room, clad not in his usual crisp shirt and tie, but in an orange jumpsuit, he appeared diminutive. The self-assurance that had earlier filled a room was nowhere to be found as to be foulness, is nowhere to be found. Was nowhere to be found, and Agudnes, Agudnes and Parchlands, just it's Tim Wizen, that out and Conspiracy, where excellence was nowhere to be fetched. He stood mutely, nearly dwarfed by the truth long overdue in catching up with him. He entered a plea of not guilty, even as the heap of evidence confronting him was more than he could reasonably hope to overcome. His court defender moved at once for a change of venue, citing that Marlington was too emotionally charged for an impartial trial. The judge concurred. The trial would proceed in Charleston. As Bennett was removed from the courtroom, he would whirly just the play artings to Madruf, or delificating trellis, Ruralcanu of the Burrellist, Austin Courthouse to Waterboom. He would attack about 2, was about to billets, or a toast list, super toast. Her family had pleaded with her not to go. Her health was poor, but Catherine refused. She had to see him one more time. Their eyes locked, hers firm, his inscrutable. She would later remember that moment. I noticed something in him that day that I'd never noticed before, she said. All those years he obscured himself behind goodness, good works, volunteer work. But that morning I saw beyond it. I saw the man who abducted my dot. Words, and that you dot to slap you silly fucking argument. And I'm seeing the dot me left to walk. I saw the man who abducted my dot. Or I stooped up. In Marlington, back home, the town itself underwent a reckoning. Bennett's hardware shut down for good. The half-assembled holiday display remained in the window, stuck, so to speak, like a time capsule from a long-gone era. Charities and civic organizations once dependent on his patronage quickly disavowed him. Neighbors who had come to regard him as friend, mentor, even role model, were left to confront an unpleasant question. How could I think the hardest part, said Pastor Robert Miller, who had served alongside Bennett at First Baptist Church, is realizing that evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it smiles at you every Sunday morning. Sometimes it brings you soup when you're sick. Sometimes it knows exactly how to earn your trust. As the year drew to a close, Marlington began to change. It was no longer the town haunted by an unsolved murder. It was the place that was the place where individuals had mourned with him, prayed with him, honored him, without any idea who he actually was. The dawn of December 4th, 2025, broke sharp and cold across the West Virginia mountains. Frost covered the roofs, and the small town of Marlington stood quietly under the wan winter light. At the precise moment of 6:15 a.m., the same moment Jessica Winters had departed to go for her run 36 years before, 6 unmarked police cars moved silently down Maple Street. Their headlights remained off, engines low. It was on purpose. In front of her stood Lieutenant Sarah Matthews, her breath misty in the cold. She afterward explained she deliberately picked that very moment. For 36 years, he awoke each more 36 years, he awoke each more toward now, he awoke each more 36 years, he awoke each more sleek, Fabrician, he awoke each more cheer. He awoke each more before here, he awoke each more slaced fear, here but therefore Jessica's family awoke to her not being there. It was fitting that his final morning as a free man should start when hers did end. The knock on the door was steady, firm, final. Lights flickered on inside the house, followed by the porch light. Then Roy Bennett appeared in the doorway, still tying the belt of his bathrobe. Matthews would later describe the moment as almost eerie in its calm. It was like he'd rehearsed it, she said, as if he always nigh. Roy Bennett, she declared firmly, you are under arrest for the murder of Jessica Winters. You have the right to remain silent. Bennett didn't protest, didn't deny, didn't even blink. As the cuffs snapped shut, he nodded almost imperceptibly and muttered in a low, even tone, I always wondered if this day would come. Took you long enough. Word of the arrest passed through Marlington with that special velocity small towns appear to excel at special velocity small towns appear to excel at 7:30 a.m. Several residents had begun to congregate in front of the sheriff's headquarters, wrapped in coats, talking in hushed tones in shock. At 9 a.m., when Catherine Winters came by with her son Michael, who had taken an overnight flight from Ohio, the crowd parted respectfully to allow her passage. The woman who had waited 36 years for answers at last had them in her grasp. Inside, Sheriff David Harrison greeted her at the door and ushered her to his office, where Lieutenant Matthews awaited her. There Catherine heard the words she had somehow already intuited. Roy Bennett had been arrested, and the case against him was strong. When she said his name, Catherine said later to the Pocahontas Times, my knees just gave out. For a second, I thought I was having a heart attack. But it wasn't pain, it was relief. 36 years of holding my breath, and all of it just released right then. The initial hearing was scheduled for December 18th. Prosecutors required time to arrange the evidence, the defense required time to prepare. The Pocahontas County Courthouse, typical tenant of small claims and land cases, was suddenly going to host the most eagerly awaited hearing in its history. Officials raced to accommodate the crowd they knew would arrive. They installed video feed in the courthouse annex and even at the high school auditorium. Schools designated a professional development day. Several shops on Main Street just closed up. All seats in the courtroom were filled by 8 a.m. neighbors in the cold 20-degree air huddled together, their breath misting as they watched the hearing on temporary screens. Former Sheriff Dale Morgan, now in his 70s and walking slowly with a cane, sat next to Catherine Winters in the front row. The atmosphere changed the moment Roy Bennett walked into the courtroom, dressed in an orange jumpsuit and shackles. This was the same individual who had once coordinated Christmas parades, redone the town playground, brought meals to ailing neighbors. And now he was charged with the same crime that had plagued Marlington for decades. It was like I was staring at a stranger with Roy's face on it, said longtime resident Martha Wilson. The way he came in, the way he looked, it was like the mask had finally fallen away. The prosecution presented its case with quiet, methodical precision. First, the DNA match. Then the fingerprint link. Then the timeline that completely unraveled Bennett's old alibi. Last of all, the pictures came up on the courtroom screen, Jessica's blue hair tie, and a plastic holder for Whitney Houston's album, the same one that she had had with her the day she disappeared. The room went silent. No one coughed. No one snickered. For the first time, the reality of what had been lost and who had stolen it was out in front of the whole town. Catherine Winters stood up slowly, resting against her son for support. The car fully cooking. The cardier that shreds the floor. The cause. Her voice, clear, steady, and brimming with quiet strength, rose above the silence as she turned to address the man who had once shared community fundraisers and potluck dinners with her. I purchased her that cassette for her birthday, she spoke in a whisper, eyes locked on Roy Bennett. You didn't merely claim her life, you claimed all that followed. Her future. Our tranquility. Her remark wasn't technically a part of the hearing, but Judge William Harrington didn't interrupt her. He just let the moment pass. After she was finished, he called for a brief recess. Catherine was quietly escorted to a side room to recover while the rest of the courtroom stayed frozen. No murmurs, no shifting, just the oppressive silence of truth at last spoken out loud. The hearing ended with Bennett ordered kept in jail without bail. The defense's motion to have the trial relocated to Charleston was granted, with the court scheduling this for April of the next year, 37 years and a day after Jessica Winters' body had been discovered along the Greenbrier River. As Bennett was ushered out, the noise that filled the room wasn't crying or anger, it was a mass release of breath. The town, it appeared, had held its breath for almost 40 years. Outside, it started snow kabadi. Catherine stood on the steps of the courthouse, her son at her side, surrounded by neighbors and friends and strangers who had waited with her all these years. Snowflakes collected in her silver hair as she gazed out at the cameras and the crowd. Jessica has justice now, she said. Not the kind that returns her, but the kind that returns truth. The kind that allows us to finally know. For Marlington, this instant did not take away the pain of this that was. A family just undertake away the pain of the tremors of tinctures, of the licht of Judas innocence, to not take away the pain of the under the just of war and in slake. For us all, we'll get lost. Look away with. For as long as anybody could remember, the identity of Jessica's murderer had hung over this town like a specter. Not knowing had been part of life, but now that darkness had a name. We can now speak her name without inquiring about who Pastor Robert Miller told a candlelight service that night. We can now mourn without fear, and we can heal, remembering Jessica for whom she was, not for what was lost. On April 17, 2026, precisely 37 years since the body of Jessica Winters was found, just 4 hours were needed for the jury to deliberate before returning with a unanimous decision, guilty. The judge sentenced Bennett to life imprisonment without parole, the maximum sentence under West Virginia law. For Marlington and all of Pocahontas County, the verdict was an ending as well as a beginning. The case that had hung like a dark cloud over them for almost 40 years was finally over. But closure didn't equate with forgetting. The truth had left its mark. Marlington will never be the same, said Mayor Patricia Collins during a town gathering after the verdict. But maybe we're not meant to be. Maybe this is our chance to become something stronger, more aware, more united, more compassionate. The case also inspired change throughout Outly, inspired change throughout Algel,
The West Virginia State Police increased their cold case unit, assigning new money and specialized units to rural cases, cases which, for too long, had fallen by the wayside. From that effort came the Jessica Winters Protocol, a statewide policy requiring cold cases to be routinely re-examined using modern forensic tools, and mandating that all alibis in major crimes be fully verified, no matter who the suspect is or how respected the for.
What occurred in Marlington could have happened anywhere, said State Police Commissioner James Harrison. Too frequently, in small communities, the individuals we trust most are the ones we never suspect. Jessica's case is a reminder to us when a life is lost, no one should be off limits. Over the following months, Marlington set about the long task of healing. There was grief, yes, but there was also contemplation. The understanding that one so trusted, so intricately part of the town's tapestry, was capable of such evil compelled people to turn inward. But within that contemplation, something positive began to take root. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to one another in years reunited. Rifts mellowed. Community gatherings, formerly tainted by tragedy, became arenas for remembrance and strength. Marlington was no longer simply the haunted town of an unresolved mystery. It was the town that survived, that learned, and that finally discovered its truth. Betrayal's hurt ultimately became something communal, something the entire town bore together rather than separately. The former Roy Bennett hardware store didn't remain dark for long. A group of local residents banded together, saved up, and purchased it. They renamed it Winter Supply in memory of Jessica. Some of its profits now go towards scholarships for students from the area who aspire to work in criminal justice or forensic science, kids motivated to bring light to the truth, as the investigators had refused to abandon Jessica's case. And the Greenbrier River Trail, once shunned, its quiet oppressive with memory, has gradually become a symbol of strength. Every spring, the townspeople come back there in a memorial walk in Jessica's honor. The first few were even led by Catherine Winters herself as she walked among friends and neighbors until her death in 2027. Now it is attended by individuals from all over West Virginia, a living memorial to Jessica's spunk and to her mother's unrelenting love. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the case isn't policy or news headlines. It's in the way that Marlington presented its narrative. For decades, the town was identified by tragedy, but with the passing of years, the narrative evolved. It became a story of determination, of a community that would not quit, regardless of the number of years that had gone by. "We aren't just the place where something terrible happened," said Hannah Roberts, Jessica's childhood friend, during the unveiling of a small memorial garden outside the courthouse. "We're the place that refused to forget, the place where a mother's love outlasted decades, the place where truth finally caught up to time, and she was right. Jessica's case wasn't another cold case. It was an open wound the entire town bore silently for years, a tale left untold until justice finally put down the last words. As we end this episode, let's recall this. Cold cases aren't piles of dusty old files. They're lives that were cut short, families still waiting, communities still hoping, hearts still seeking peace. If this tale touched you, take a moment to subscribe to Revealed Crime Cases. We tell stories that count, stories where jailed GA. And if there's a case you think needs the same attention, let us know in the comments below. Your recommendations lead us to uncover the stories that could otherwise go untold. Because every victim should be remembered, and all truth should be spoken, no matter how long it takes.